I had one client who was following to the T the gluten-free diet that her husband followed. She was surprised when I asked her if she liked to eat this way, and her response was, "No, not particularly." Then I asked her if she had an allergy to gluten. Again, her answer was no. She was also feeling tired all the time, and it was obvious to me that her diet simply didn't meet her specific needs. The fad diet popularity may stem from the belief that maybe there's an easy way, a quick way to improve body composition. It also stems from the thought that there may be one diet that is best for everyone. But this just isn't the case. Your personal preferences and physiology have a lot to do with your success in changing body composition through diet and exercise. However, I know that the media attention and science behind some diets is interesting and appealing, but also downright confusing. In this lecture, I will highlight some interesting key points and new research for traditional diets and popular fad diets. Then, I'll wrap it all up with my personal thoughts on choosing your own nutrition path. For many years, the conventional approach to eating in the U.S. was to follow the food guide pyramid. No doubt you've heard of this pyramid before. In fact, many countries have some pyramid design to indicate their eating recommendations. The original design had a wide base of grains, indicating you should build a diet primarily from carbohydrates, leading up to a peak of fat and oils to use sparingly. In 2011, the traditional pyramid was replaced with something called MyPlate, which is an image of a plate with the food groups on it. Now, the new plate graphic has been both praised and criticized, but it does at least seem like it makes sense to show food on a plate rather than in a pyramid. It was designed to remind Americans to eat healthfully, but not necessarily to change consumer behavior. So this guide is designed to remind us to eat healthfully, but this assumes that most Americans know how to eat healthfully, and that healthfully actually has a definition that is the same for everyone. If you take a glance at the MyPlate recommendations, you'll see that it is a bit hard to interpret which foods should be a priority or which foods are recommended. This may not be the best thing for people who are less informed about food types and quality. The MyPlate recommendations do encourage variety in what we eat, and they provide some visual cues for proportion of vegetables, fruit, grains, and protein that should be on your plate. It also encourages whole grain consumption rather than simply more grain consumption. And these are all good things, right? MyPlate recommendations, however, are very general. The MyPlate diet traditionally is thought of as a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. And it suggests that a plate 75% full of grains, vegetables, and fruit, which are all sources of carbohydrates, is the best for everyone, regardless of how active your lifestyle is. For very active people, and especially people who like to work out at high intensities, a higher carbohydrate diet has been supported in the research more times than not. This, though, is usually based upon improving exercise or sport performance, but not everyone is concerned with that type of performance. You may be much more interested in body weight or body composition. You have to keep in mind that the overall calorie and carbohydrate needs of someone who is physically active will be different from someone of the same size and sex who is sitting still all day typing on a computer, for example. It is also important to remember that constantly high blood sugar levels, which you might get following a very high carbohydrate diet without enough exercise, are at least related to many different sorts of ailments, including well-known type 2 diabetes. And don't get me wrong, I don't believe that carbohydrates are inherently a problem, but it is the overconsumption of them combined with a lack of physical activity that tends to get us into some body composition trouble. If you review the MyPlate recommendations more closely, they also suggest that real fruit and 100% fruit juice and real vegetables and 100% vegetable juice are the same thing. However, the ways we digest and absorb solid food compared to liquids are different in many ways, including how fast the nutrients get into your body. In addition, many juices are loaded with added sugars that real fruit does not contain. But I do like the overall emphasis on eating more fruit and vegetables. Lastly, it's important to note that healthy fats don't have a place. Olive oil, avocado, and fish or fish oil are not included at all. And you may recall that healthy fats have a major place in our diets and have some wonderful health benefits. Another drawback is that there is not really a distinction between better choices and worse choices of proteins or carbohydrates. If you check out most of the epidemiological scientific literature, the overall theme is quite consistent for health and weight loss in overweight individuals. You should consume more healthy fats and reduce your intake of refined carbohydrates. There are both pluses and minuses with a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. And it's entirely dependent upon how you feel, look, and perform when eating this way. Over much of the same time that we have been told that a higher carb, low fat diet is best for us, primarily from the MyPlate recommendations, our obesity and diabetes rates have skyrocketed. So naturally, people have been drawn to drastically different eating styles to see if they provide their health and body composition improvements. Thus, the high-fat, low-carb diet was born. This sort of eating goes by many names like Atkins, Paleo, and now Keto. And while these are actually different diets, some major similarities exist. So, what if we eat fewer carbs and more fat? Well, advocates of the high-fat, low-carb diets point to research that shows more fat oxidation or fat burning with this sort of diet and rapid weight loss. So, what does this really mean? Eating a high-fat diet means that fat would make up 60 to 75% of your total caloric intake. The assumption with high-fat diets is that if carbohydrate feeding lowers your ability to burn fat, then a high-fat diet would increase your ability to burn fat as a fuel. It sounds like this might improve body composition, doesn't it? Overall, there is actually a lot of evidence to show improvements in health, body composition, and other physiological functions with a higher fat, low carbohydrate approach. For example, with the high-fat, low-carb diet, there is a higher fat oxidation during exercise, increased availability of free fatty acids, and increased activity of fat oxidation enzymes. Additionally, there is a reduction in enzymes involved with glycolysis, which is the breakdown of sugar to provide energy, along with reduced muscle glycogen and liver glycogen storage. This may be a really critical point. If you can better control blood sugar with a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, this could be highly useful for controlling body fat and ultimately your overall body composition. Also, as you might remember from an earlier lecture, fat and protein tend to keep you feeling full for a longer period of time than carbohydrates alone. So, if you can use a high-fat, low-carb approach to improve some health outcomes and maybe even body composition, what's wrong with it? Well, first, it's often carried out incorrectly. What I mean is that when I review what people are actually eating while on a high-fat diet, they usually just eat more fast food, fried food, and processed meats. More often than not, I see a high fat intake with no concern for the type of fat, along with a normal amount of carbohydrate intake. Ultimately, with a plan like this, health does not seem to improve. Second, there are some questions as to the feasibility of a high-fat diet, low-carb diet, when you bring exercise into the equation. Let me explain. Some studies show no difference in exercise performance after you eat a high-fat or high-carb diet. However, these studies usually involve exercise that is done at a low to moderate intensity, like 45% of your VO2 max, or your maximal oxygen consumption. That's likely a slow walk. And as you know, this relatively low level of intensity should rely more on fat as a fuel. So it makes sense that exercise performance was no different. But what happens if you exercise at a high intensity or for prolonged periods of time, say 2 to 3 hours or more at one time?